Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us on this webinar on implementing WebMI. It's roughly about 20 or so minutes, and if you have any questions, you can put them in at any point and we'll get to those at the end.
Hello and welcome to today's webinar. Today we'll be doing an overview of capabilities of WebMI in Seascape. Let's get started. Let's look at our agenda for today. To begin, we'll go through an introduction of WebMI. We're going to look at how it works, and then we'll look at creating web pages which you don't need HTML programming knowledge for. We'll look at publishing the web pages you create, and we'll give you some hints to make your experience with WebMI as smooth as possible. There'll be demonstrations throughout, and we'll finish with a Q&A session. WebMI is the capability for Horner all-in-one controllers to serve up web pages over Ethernet from their local slot. These web pages are typically used for remote monitoring and control. Web pages created through WebMI are done so through Seascape, and you don't need any additional programming knowledge. The web pages that are created using HTML5, meaning they're compatible with nearly all web browsers. So how does it work? WebMI pages are developed in Seascape, and they're loaded to a folder on the micro SD card that has to be installed in the OCS prior. It can then connect with other devices through their own web browsers. If you want to access OCS units from outside the factory, you need to bypass the firewalls in place. For most medium to large companies, that usually means hiring a third-party company to provide a path using one of these providers listed on the screen. Smaller companies will often allow their key vendors to get in through firewalls or poke holes in their firewall to the point where they can access their WebMI features remotely. Next, we'll look at creating and publishing web pages in Seascape. So the web pages are created in Seascape, and there are two approaches. First, you can replicate screens that have already been developed in the OCS, so has the same content and is in the same resolution. And you have the option to have it work synchronously or asynchronously. The second approach you can take is create completely new web pages using the Seascape Web Designer configuration. This allows you to select higher resolutions if necessary, but it is always an asynchronous approach. With either approach, there is no need to learn any new languages. So first, we'll look at creating a web page by replicating an existing OCS screen in your project. The general process is to open the application, open the graphics editor, set up user credentials, adjust WebMI parameters, and then publish the web pages. There are two ways to transfer the web pages once they're created: directly over FTP or to your computer, where they can be manually copied to your SD card. The last step is to launch a browser and test it. Now we'll look at the process of creating existing pages works. So here we have our existing developed Seascape project. We'll enter the graphics editor by selecting this icon at the top of our screen. As you can see, we have a simple one-screen application, but there are some things we must do before we can turn them into web pages. So first, we'll go to the configuration at the top left of our screen. We go down and select Security Configuration. This is a list of the login credentials user can use to gain access from their web browser. In this case, you can see that we've added a user, a password, and an access level. An access level is assigned to every object that has an action in it. For example, a button ranges from 0 to 7. The higher the access level, the higher the security level required to edit the button. In this case, the user has an access level of 3, So any object with an access level of 3 or lower will be accessible to the user. Next, we're going to go to the screens, which can be found in the top left of the screen. We scroll down and we select Web Options. The first parameter is listed. When a user logs into a device, a title is going to appear on their web page. So first, we'll add this name to the company name, so ACE Manufacturing. The second parameter is the connection timeout interval. This is how long it will take for your browser not connecting to the internet for it to time out. Next is Enable Screen Sync. Screen sync is an option you can check if you're just replicating your existing screens. What Screen Sync does is whenever the screen changes locally by the operator, if you're monitoring via WebMI at the time, that screen is also going to change remotely. In this case, we're not going to check that. Next is Inhibit Session Timeout. That's an option where we can decide to stop session timeouts from occurring, even if there's a lack of user activity. We're going to leave this unchecked for now. Now we'll look at our advanced settings. Here we have a keep alive interval as well as a published interval. In general, it is recommended to leave these default, as there's almost never any reason to change them. We also have an authentication type, which we have set a digest authentication. This is the level of authentication. Keep in mind, if you're using a device from a company like Signia, they will be providing all security. So in that scenario, you may want to change it to basic authentication. Most of the time, you can leave the advanced options alone. So lastly, we'll go to the WebMI tab in the center top of our screen. From here, you can publish the website, launch the website, and display and validate the license and publish to removable media. The first thing I want to do is display and validate my WebMI license. This shows me my MAC address and how many users and data points I've been authorized for. I'm now ready to publish. So what this means is Skiscape will take the screens we have already created and it's going to turn those into web pages. And there's a few ways I can do that. So firstly, we can go to WebMI at the top of our screen and we can select Publish. This will publish the web pages and then attempt to communicate locally over FTP to transfer those web pages. The other way we can do it is by publishing to removable media. That way we can copy the web files over to a memory card. And that process happens quickly. So you don't have to depend on a file transfer over FTP. We can just transfer those licenses over the memory card. After selecting to publish over removable media, it asks me to browse my folders. In this case, I'm not going to write it directly to my memory card. I'm going to read it to my desktop. During this process, Seascape is exporting and publishing. So let's say OK and close down Seascape. And now we'll look at my files on removable media. So now we need to copy that entire folder as it is to my removable media memory card. So I can right click and select to removable disk. To check this, I'm going to enter my file manager and take a look at it. So just looking at removable disk, there's a data logging form on the WebMI folder I just put in. There's also a firmware.license file that I received earlier. So now we'll put this removable memory back into the OCS. To test out with WebMI, I'm going to open Chrome and input the IP address into the URL. Now we have the user login and I'm going to log in and I'm going to enter details we created in the graphics section. The first time you log into WebMI, you have to agree to a license agreement. But once this is done, you won't have to do it again. So here is a real-world view. So if I were to operate the OCS, I would see a clear reaction throughout. As you can see, there's a visible on the screen, and this is accurately portraying my work on the OCS. So there we go. With a small few steps, we've taken an existing project with existing screens and published those as web pages using WEBMI. Next, we're going to look at creating new web pages using what's called a Seascape Web Designer project. All units can support this approach to web creation. The process is almost identical on the back end, but the difference comes in the front end. So what does this process look like? We start out by opening a new file. Then we go to the Web Designer, select Web Designer as our target. We select the resolution we want to use for our web page. We go back to our existing application, copy our names, and paste them into the current Web Designer file. Then we go to the new project and the graphics editor and start developing screens as if it were a high-resolution OCS. Once we've created our screens, we do everything else the exact same way. We set up the user credentials, adjust WebMI parameters, and publish. So we'll look at that now. We're back in the existing application again. This time, we're going to create brand new web pages from scratch. The first thing to do is go to the top left of our screen, click File, New Project, and select OK. The next step is to enter the hardware configuration through this icon in the top right of the screen. It's currently configured for our target because that's what we're connected to. But in this case, under Series, we want to switch to Web Designer. So now we have our choice of 3 different resolutions, and we're going to select the middle one. So we've created the project for Web Designer with this screen that's 1200 by 800 resolution. Before we start designing the pages, it would be helpful if we had all the same I/O names from our original application in the new application. So we're going to go back to the original application, which was called Purge Fill. I'm going to go to the I/O names section, Program I/O names. I'm going to copy all of these, go back to the new Web Designer project. Then we go into the I/O name section for this project and hit paste. We're asked if we're sure we want to do that, and we select yes. So now all the I/O names that were present in the original application that's running on the controller are available to choose from when we go to create a new web page. So now I'm going to the graphics editor, and you can see that I have a 1200 by 800 window. To show you in action, we're going to put time data on the screen. The real-time clock can be accessed in the OCS from System Register number 44. Starting in System Register 44, we're going to go with hours, minutes, and seconds for time. We're going to set a large font and center it. We don't need a legend, so we're going to remove it. Now we'll go and pick out some data from the actual application. So we're going to create a new gauge object from this icon. This is where we can pick one of the existing variables. In this case, we'll go ahead and select inlet pressure in PSI, which is on my list. We know that's a scale from 0 to 400, so we've created a simple gauge. And we will also create a bar graph as well. Now we'll make this one for tank pressure. Next, we're going to fast forward through the standard screen creation. So again, we pick tank pressure from the list, and we're going to change the color to green. We're going to set the legend to tank_PSI. We'll change the background to blue, and we're going to set this object's background blue. And as the writing can be a little hard to see, we're going to set its text to white. So now we'll create another screen to show you how easy this is. And let's actually move the time over to another screen. So we're going to use a jump box because we want to show you how to change screens relatively easily. So let's say we're going to go to screen number 2 with this screen jump, and let's label a time. And when we go to screen number 2, let's give it a different background. we're going to go ahead and paste that time object that we had on the other page, and we're going to need a better way of getting back to the home page. So we'll add another jump button here. And this one we want to go to screen 1, which is correct. We're going to remove the legend. And we're going to set the attribute to the home icon. So it's nothing special, but it's a quick and easy web page. We're going to show a data object while we're here, so we're grabbing a numeric data object from the top left of our screens. Now we're going to show tank pressure as numeric data. So we select tank pressure from the list, and we'll make engineering units as PSI. We'll make our font a pretty good size, and we'll change the legend to tank PSI. We're going to set it as non-editable. Lastly, we're going to enlarge the legend text. So now we're going to go ahead and finish the process, just like we did when we had our original screens. So if you remember, the first thing we need to do is set up our user access credentials. Here in our security configuration, we need to add a user. So we're going to just type this in as Chuck, the same credentials as we used before. Again, we'll give the access level of 3. We could give it from anything from 0 to 7. A 5-minute timeout is fine here. We're going to go back here under Screens for Web Options and change to ACE Manufacturing, but leave everything else alone. And now we're going to go over to the top left of the screen and we're going to publish removable media. Next, I'm going to publish to my desktop. The web files have been exported successfully to removable media. So this should be sitting here on the desktop. So now we'll close the graphics window and minimize Seascape. And there we can see our WebMI files. So we'll go and right-click on them and send them to the E drive. In my case, the E drive is where my micro SD card got mapped into my computer. So now we'll verify that the WebMI folder got mapped to the micro SD card. And there it is, still up in the folder, just as we expected. We moved the memory card over. So it's now back in the OCS. Next, we'll navigate to the OCS IP address. Here's our login, and we're going to sign in. It just started up, and you'll hear that beep on the OCS. Now we'll hit the purge button and watch it go down. If we want to switch screens, we can press the button here, which takes me to this next page. Alright, so that's the process for creating new web pages. There are 2 methods for transferring our web page files over to the OCS. With FTP, the folder is copied over FTP. FTP transfers are convenient but can be time-consuming. Direct transfers are 2-step processes initiated using the Publish to Removable Media option. The WebMI folder is copied over to a local computer and is then manually copied to a microSD card by the user. There is an extra step, but overall it is much faster and more reliable. Now we'll look at some helpful hints. WebMI has been available for a while, and we've continued to make improvements both on the Seascape side and the firmware side. And so, some of the new firmware will be recommended for making the process work better, as well as including some new features, like timeline control, for example. Another point I should make, if your time and date on the OCS are inaccurate, sometimes that can trip up the licensing, even though the license isn't necessarily time-based. After you've licensed your OCS, you can go to the System menu and look under License Details and see if your license is active. You can also display /valid license in the graphics editor while you're connected online to an OCS to see how many data points and how many pages used at runtime. After you've licensed through OCS, you can go to the System menu and take a look at the license details and see if your licensing is still active. Next, we'll go through some hints on the LAN configuration side. WebMI is available on LAN 1 and on the USB to Wi-Fi adapter wireless LAN. Make sure your LANs are on different subnets. We still have a legacy choice in the LAN configuration for HTTP/web server. So don't select the HTTP resident protocol, it will cause errors. And lastly, if you're not sure, you can communicate to the unit from your web browser. A good thing to do is to ping a unit just to make sure that you can actually communicate with us between your computer and the OCS itself over the Ethernet connection. If you decide to use FTP to transfer between Seascape and the unit, you use the Published Web Pages option and the graphics editor. And before you use that option, make sure FTP is working. It requires that FTP be set up in Seascape for that OCS, and that configuration be downloaded into the OCS to make sure FTP is enabled. You're going to want to make sure that once you press the Publish Website button, you get the FTP pop-up that's shown here. And lastly, you're going to want to type in the target IP. That's the OCS IP address. You don't want to change the target folder, and the username and password it's asking for are actually the FTP username and password, not any of the login credentials from the web browser for logging into WebMI. As a test for FTP before you start using a WebMI or using Seascape to publish your web pages over FTP, it's a good idea to use a web browser or an FTP client just to verify that everything's working properly. That concludes our webinar for today. Thank you so much for listening, and the Q&A session will begin shortly.
Okay, a nice recap on WebMI. There will be no webinar next week as we are at SPS in Nuremberg. So if anyone is at the show, feel free to stop by. But we will be back the following week then with a webinar again. I think that's it for today. I don't see any questions. So thank you all for joining, and we'll see you again soon.